The significant issue pertaining to student learning that we chose was inclusive education and the inclusive classroom. We chose this topic because it was a common issue in all our schools. When we looked at the students targeted for inclusive education in Trinidad, we found that all of us had students like these in our classrooms that fell under the categories of disability. For example, orthopedic impairments, deaf or blindness, visual impairments, developmental delays, emotional disturbance, and much more. Our argument states that infrastructural development and teacher training are necessary for the implementation of strategies aimed at achieving inclusive education in schools.
Inclusive education, as defined in the Salamanca Statement of 1994, entails recognition of the need to work towards schools for all. These schools for all are institutions which include everybody, celebrate differences, support learning, and respond to individual needs. Inclusion in the context of education is based on the idea that all children should learn together, regardless of differences or disability. It is in this vein that inclusive education itself is seen as a rights-based philosophy. The right to education is recognized globally through a number of frameworks. In 2000, the Dhaka Framework for Action adopted the World Declaration on Education for All, which affirmed the notion of education as a fundamental right. EFA also clearly identified inclusive education as one of the key strategies to address issues of marginalization and exclusion. This right to education is addressed globally by a number of policies. It is contained in Article 11 of the African Charter on Human and Persons' Rights, while in Trinidad and Tobago, the Ministry of Education outlines in the National School Code of Conduct its commitment to provide access, equity, and quality in education in support of its efforts to reform, expand, and modernize the education system. This right to education is one of the key principles underpinning Sustainable Development Goal 4 adopted by the international community. SDG 4, being rights based, outlines the full enjoyment of the right to education as fundamental to the achievement of sustainable development. It states that education in itself is an important right and one of the most powerful tools by which economically and socially marginalized children and adults can lift themselves out of poverty and participate fully in society. This right to education is one of the key principles underpinning Sustainable Development Goal 4 adopted by the international community. SDG 4, being rights based, outlines the full enjoyment of the right to education as fundamental to the achievement of sustainable development. It states that education in itself is an important right and one of the most powerful tools by which economically and socially marginalized children and adults can lift themselves out of poverty and participate fully in society. Targets 4.4, 4.5, and 4A specifically address the provision of skills, elimination of discrimination, and importantly, the need for suitable infrastructure to ensure the attainment of SDG number 4. This thereby highlights the need for suitable infrastructure to support the delivery of inclusive education in all schools. The practical implementation of this rights-based philosophy is guided by a number of theoretical frameworks. Behaviorism, as a theoretical approach to education, sees learning as a change in behavior. This change is brought about by conditioning which occurs when consequences are associated with stimulus or a response. According to an article published by the Asian Institute for Research, the behaviorist theory is related to some of the best practices in education. The article further outlines that the implementation of inclusive education from a behaviorist perspective requires direct instruction in a teacher-led environment where the teacher facilitates student learning. The implication of the behaviorist theory, therefore, is that inclusive education requires teacher training to allow for the teacher to be able to conduct functional behavioral analyses so that he or she is able to provide assessment, evaluation, and feedback that allow for the remediation of gaps in student learning. However, according to a report by Johnstone in 2010, only 42% of teachers in Trinidad and Tobago reported that they understood what is necessary to teach in an inclusive classroom, which directly affects their ability to facilitate learning for disabled students. The implication of the behaviorist theory, therefore, is that inclusive education requires teacher training to allow for the teacher to be able to conduct functional behavioral analyses so that he or she is able to provide assessment, evaluation, and feedback that allow for the remediation of gaps in student learning. However, according to a report by Johnstone in 2010, only 42% of teachers in Trinidad and Tobago reported that they understood what is necessary to teach in an inclusive classroom, which directly affects their ability to facilitate learning for disabled students. Constructivism, on the other hand, focuses on the creation of cognitive tools that promote understanding of a social dimension during the learning process. Allowing students to explore complex real-world contexts are therefore important to the reflective process. These reflections then create relationships between disconnected concepts. Those connections and relationships are what enables the learning process. For those who believe that the constructivist approach is the best way to define learning, two key elements are underscored. Firstly, the notion that there must be the creation of learning environments that directly expose the learner to the material being studied. Secondly, that this learning must take place within a suitable constructivist learning environment. This is directly related to the cognitive learning process, which is in itself a mental process. The argument being put forward, therefore, questions the level of teacher training within our education system to support the use of a diversity of instructional and assessment strategies that would facilitate the conceptual understanding associated with constructivist learning. The level of infrastructural development within schools in Trinidad and Tobago to enable school communities to create the necessary learning environment alluded to in the preceding quote is also problematic, as constructivist learning environments require the layout of classrooms to facilitate discussions, since student-to-student interactions are seen as equally important in the learning process as teacher-to-student interactions.
HFLE deals with the social, emotional, and spiritual well-being of all students. Students with disabilities and special needs are included. It also deals with appropriate eating and fitness. In 1996, CARICOM's Standing Committee of Ministers of Health and Education endorsed the HFLE document in CARICOM member states. It is therefore necessary that infrastructural development and teacher training be implemented to achieve inclusive education. According to the Issues of Inclusive Education for Action, UNESCO 1994, the following will influence how successful inclusive education and HFLE can be. Infrastructural development is necessary to support learning to a great extent. In order for students to facilitate learning, the environment must be ideal. The resources and facilities in the school must be creative to promote a positive learning environment. This includes physical elements, which encourages students to be relaxed. Students with special needs require well-defined areas. One of the most important areas needed is a sensory area or a resource center. Teacher training is necessary so they can modify instructional materials and curricula to meet students' varied needs. It enables them to choose and apply methods and concepts to the entire class if it is appropriate and effective. With the necessary teaching methods adopted, it must complement curriculum adaptation. Goal-directed, individualized strategies are recommended. Special attention may be paid to pace of learning and the level of performance of each child in class. Short breaks to retain attention span, peer teaching, and using creative and interactive teaching aids are all aimed at inclusive education. The HFLE Regional Curriculum Framework suggests that HFLE be taught so that students build the capacity to make healthy eating choices in order to support productivity. It also teaches all students how to be fit and demonstrate good health practices. Healthy eating is very crucial for cognitive development, especially for students with special needs. Spirituality can be a source of psychological support for disabled students. It can improve the relationship with people and cause some of them to accept and live with the problems they face with respect to them having special needs. It also causes them to have a reawakened hope and peace of mind. Attention to the spiritual dimension can also help students feel a sense of value and belonging. With the implementation of inclusion within public education, it is essential that teachers be trained to meet the needs of all students, including those with mental illness or problems. Teachers need to learn how to teach students who experience difficulties with their mental health, as it is estimated that by 2020 the prevalence of neuropsychiatric disorders in children will continue to rise, making them one of the five leading causes of childhood illness, disability, and death. With the rising prevalence of mental health problems in young people, teachers need to be aware of how to recognize and support students with mental health problems as it may impact their lives and classroom settings. Adequate training and consultation are necessary for teachers to teach students effectively. The establishment and consistent implementation of classroom rules and regulations is vital to successfully manage students' individual learning styles and behaviors as students with disabilities tend to be disruptive. Special needs students are deprived of a suitable education when they are taught at a mismatched level with students without disabilities. This can negatively affect a student's self-esteem and dignity. Even in physical education classes, students with physical disabilities are disadvantaged because the curriculum is not geared to include them. These factors can cause students with disabilities to face discrimination and bullying from their peers, which can reflect in the development of low self-esteem, isolation, depression, and in some cases, aggression.
Sociology and the inclusive classroom. We ask the question, how does the level of infrastructural development and training to facilitate students with physical and learning disabilities become a social issue? Education is a social institution. And because we define sociology as the study of social institutes, it therefore becomes a social issue. The relationships between social class, gender, ethnicity, school type, learning achievement, etc., all deal with the sociology of education. Therefore, the issue of students with physical and learning disabilities would fall under the sociology of education. Defining what type of society we live in will give us a better understanding of how we deal with educational issues. In a Marxist society, they see dysfunctions in learning as some deficiency in either the child, resources, or the classroom environment. Whereas in a functionalist society, those deficiencies are treated with compensatory mechanisms, one of which is the inclusive classroom. It states that all children should be able to participate in every aspect of school life despite ethnicity, gender, disability, and so on. Socialization is an important aspect in children's lives, interacting with their peers, feeling that sense of normalcy. And it is one of the driving reasons behind the inclusive classroom. But is this occurring here in Trinidad and Tobago? Are we truly a functionalist society, or are we really a Marxist society masked as a functionalist one? We have adapted the UNESCO's framework Education for All, but are our schools really equipped for these policies? Looking at how inclusive classrooms work in other countries would give us an indication how it's supposed to work and the social implications they have on students. The following video looks at inclusive education and children with disabilities in Serbia and UNICEF's involvement in promoting inclusive education.
Children with disabilities are among the most vulnerable and excluded in the world. Their rights are often violated. Hidden at home or placed in special institutions, a child with disabilities often misses out on education. They grow up apart from their families. Parents fear their children with disabilities will be mocked and won't have a chance to take part in society. The World Report on Disabilities estimates that 1 in 10 children under the age of 15 lives with disabilities, meaning they are not unusual. Despite the challenges, many countries in Central and Eastern Europe and in Central Asia are making positive changes in their lives.
Everyone in my class thinks that I am a good friend and a good student.
Alexa is a satisfied and happy boy who lives in a healthy environment with friends who accept him and teachers who meet his needs when it's necessary.
UNICEF is working with governments to support education systems, families, and children to reduce inequities created by social exclusion.
When as many children as possible have access to quality education, it's good for the society as such, because then you enrich the whole society also at the same time.
Regionally, many countries in the Caribbean are trying to adopt the inclusive classroom approach, but some countries are not equipped for it to work to the benefit of the students. For example, in St. Lucia, they recognize that the approach is not fully understood by all state personnel. They recognize its importance, but believes it is not currently a government priority due to financial constraints. St. Lucia's Ministry of Education believes that all levels of the government has to be involved, but because they are not able to, they won't be moving forward with implementing the policy. They recognize that cons outweigh the pros. Here in Trinidad, we have subscribed to UNESCO's definition of inclusion. Inclusive education is not only about students with disabilities, but quality of education for all, recognizing that every child can learn. And as such, there is the seamless education approach which includes all types of learners. However, there is conflicting evidence on the implementation of the inclusive classroom here in Trinidad and Tobago. According to my with researchers found through interviews that the initiative is still developing and cannot provide inclusive education at this stage, and most policy documents exist as just drafts and lack the authority needed for implementation. Trinidad and Tobago's plan for inclusive education has 6 basic goals still to be implemented, including providing training for all personnel in schools and to upgrade physical facilities. In conclusion, Trinidad and Tobago is claiming a seamless education approach to inclusive education, but there's evidence to the contrary. There are many aspects that need addressing before we can achieve the ideal functionalist society where all students, regardless of disabilities, are able to socialize with their peers in an environment that would cater to their special needs.